right, everyone. Hi. Thank you so much for coming to our talk on DarkSide Striking Back as BlackMatter. My name is Lindsay Kaye, and I'm Director for Operational Outcomes at Recorded Future at Insight Group. So I run our technical arm of our threat intelligence team. So by trade, I was a software engineer for many years before getting into reverse engineering and malware analysis.
And hi, I'm James Niven. I'm a principal threat researcher, also at Recorded Future. And previously to Recorded Future, I did a lot of red teaming for offensive security and CrowdStrike. And it gave me a unique perspective into how actors would actually work day to day.
Awesome. So before we get started, we're going to talk about a couple of high-level terms in case you're not super familiar with ransomware and ransomware operations. So first, ransomware is a service. So at a very high level, this is a program who's run by a group of people called administrators. So they're responsible for creating the malware, managing the infrastructure, and other aspects of the actual program itself. And people called affiliates or advertisers will obtain membership in the program in order to get access to it. So they'll do so in a couple different ways. So either by vouchers or by paying for access. And part of the benefit for an aspiring affiliate of joining a RAS is actually being able to kind of have that name recognition. So you can imagine if you want to lock someone's net and you want them to pay, having that name recognition that ensures that if they pay you, they'll get the decryption key is good. But also the RAS will take over some of the other aspects of it because you get access to a developer who can add new features, do bug fixes, other things like that. Some of the victim payment infrastructure, different things like that, so you don't have to do it on your own. So next, tools and TTPs. So very basically, things that actors use at a technical level. So you may hear things like malware, malicious tools, and then how they actually use them. So big game hunting. So around 2019, instead of targeting individuals, ransomware threat actors began actually targeting organizations, largely because they have more of an ability and willingness to pay the ransom than those individuals. And then finally, the underground ecosystem. So this is where one would buy and sell malware, malicious tools, and different kinds of access to organizations. So we'll get into some of that later, but that could include stolen credentials, VPN, RDP, etc. And then finally, how threat actors can communicate with others. So ransomware is a business, and we're going to talk about a couple different aspects of what this business entails. So first, gaining access. So how does a threat actor first gain access to a target system or organization? Next, acquiring data. So how do they acquire the data? What does it include? And then what can they do with it? Next, buying and selling of tools and data. So largely dark web marketplaces and shops. And then finally, things that they can acquire to enable operation and infrastructure aspects of the ransomware program. I hand it over to James.
Thanks, Lindsay. So speaking of the underground ecosystem and the way that they have ability to buy and sell things, they've commoditized almost everything. It can range from something small like Netflix accounts, credentials there, or it can range up to initial access. So Pulse, Fortinet, VPNs, logins for RDP sitting on the net. And these are done by initial access brokers. So as she spoke to earlier, ransomware can also be commoditized, where you pay a certain amount of money to get into the program, 0.1 Bitcoin or something, for instance, for non-Russian speakers. Malware checkers, stealers, exploits, brute forces for credentials, all this is sold and hashed out in different programs. It can also range to C2 frameworks. So Cobalt Strike, for instance, it's not necessarily paid for, or I mean, it's not necessarily open source, but you have cracked versions of it lying around, and you have CNA scripts or aggressor scripts, which can make a lot of this stuff just one click. You right click and you can Kerber roast an entire network. So on the business of that, this is actually exploit. This screenshot is BlackMatter when they first arrived. And this is the country codes that they're looking for. And the reason they choose these country codes is because those are the people that are most likely to pay. We have cybersecurity and whatnot. More mature companies will pay for that. And they say that they don't want any access for medical or state institutions. They want companies or networks that have over $100 million worth of revenue. And more or less, they're looking for access here. So there's two primary forums for Russian-based ransomware. It's exploit and XSS. And the way that it will typically work is if you see this post and you want information on it, it doesn't make a lot of sense to respond to it right there, because then law enforcement or another researcher that's watching it is going to get privy to that and start hunting you. So what you do is you send a private message to this, but knowing that forums can be compromised, you want to leave as much information out of that private message. So you would create a one-time note, like a priv note, that would say, I'm interested in this, here's my Talks or Telegram account or Jabber, and then take all communication off that platform. So even if an administrator or compromised the forums, they would have no trace of it. And once the Colonial pipeline attack happened, everybody was really bearing down on those forums and just watching every single word. So how do they hide? Ransomware actors are much like normal everyday red teamers. They'll use things that are built into Windows LOL bins. For instance, MSHTA and MSBuild. If you send an HTA file, it's essentially an HTML file, and tell it to build code on the machine using .NET Framework, MSBuild, or CSC, you essentially build the payload on the victim machine and bypasses a lot of initial detections. They will also use Windows management tools, so Active Directory. They can do a lot of damage by having access to Active Directory. Tell all the machines to start updating and looking for a specific file. For instance, the locker in the syslogin or netlogin directory on the domain controller, everything can read it and it'll fire away at once. Common applications that are on a lot of networks, Slack and Okta. Slack's a really good example. GitHub is too. So if you have a password for a guest Wi-Fi, it may be applicable to other things in the network that you could scan for. And red team tools, so Sharphound, Rubius, Cobalt Strike, those are all, not all of them are open source, but they're on GitHub and they're very heavily documented. And the actors will use them and not have any real issues with it. And they can also customize it. So, as we were speaking, they innovate. This is an example of the Revil panel before they were shut down. So this shows that Revix at the bottom is their Linux locker. It shows all the changes with it and different architectures it applies to. Revil 2.7 was not their last, but it was the one right before their last update, and it shows all the changes that happened to that. And the entire time we tracked Revil, they had about 15 versions of their Windows ransomware.
Cool. So why does this actually matter? So Revil was not kind of an anomaly, right? Threat actors, especially ransomware threat actors, will keep innovating largely because they have to. So first, they are following security trends. So you might hear new vulnerabilities that are discovered. If you ever read any sort of like incident response reports to look at how other threat actors were caught, what defenders are looking for, any sort of new research that's coming out. So if we have access to it, consider the fact that they also do, and they are learning from it. So they'll read news, articles, research, things that we publish ourselves. So they are getting insights there and following those trends and often incorporating that into their own ransomware. So, like I said, that they have access to a developer is part of the Ransomware as a Service program. So this means new features that affiliates are requesting or might be effective in helping get the companies to pay the ransom. Different sort of optimizations because in a ransomware attack, they want to encrypt as much as they can as fast as they can. Things like antivirus evasion and anti-reverse engineering techniques, so make it harder for the defenders to catch you and then take it apart and figure out how to write effective detections for you. And then bug fixes, so if something is broken, the developer will often fix it. So what this means is that we really can't just use one approach to finding them and rooting them out. So we often like to talk about tracking the different versions of their tools, but this can really change over time. So 15 versions of Revil's Windows ransomware alone, while not everything changed between versions, this is something that does evolve over time. We can't rely entirely on it. Infrastructure is something that is spun up and down, so you can't really use that as sort of a long-term tracking thing necessarily. And James talked a little bit about some of those common TTPs and red team tools that they do use, so you can leverage some of that, but that really isn't the whole story as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk through an IRL example of how this happened at the mid to late part of last year. So looking specifically at how a ransomware threat actor rapidly evolved their software in response to several external factors, like discovery by security researchers, and some of the demand for new features in their malware. So we're going to use BlackMatter as an example, and we actually discovered the group in July 2021, and shortly thereafter put out a technical deep dive on the malware.
So the way we discovered BlackMatter was, it was right place, right time, but with some good knowledge. So we're familiar with the Colonial Pipeline attack. It caused a lot of issues at the pump, got a lot of law enforcement, focused right on DarkSide. So DarkSide really went into hiding. Some of their people got caught, and they backed down for a bit. So with DarkSide out of the picture for now, we still have Revil. So Revil has Windows, Linux locker, like we talked about, and ESXi locker. So ESXi locker is really, really important because you can have all these magical tools for Windows to protect Windows host, but if you host them all on ESXi, which has none of these cool tools, and you lock the data store, the entire network's locked. So ESXi is really, really effective. And so with all the pressure on DarkSide, them going away, and this was during the time of the US and Russian talks about ransomware as a whole. So this screenshot on the bottom is actually from the Revil panel, and it's from the administrator. He says, well, previous to that, he said, no attacks on USA for 2 weeks until these talks are over. This thing actually is addressing the JBS Foods case. So JBS Foods, the top one is from JBS Foods to the FBI saying, we got attacked by Revil. We're shut down, we have a lot of issues. So everyone said JBS Foods is a USA company. It's not technically, and that's what that post is saying. It's JBS SA out of Brazil. JBS Foods USA does exist, but it's a subset. So they are arguing that they didn't attack a USA company. So this caused a lot of focus on Revil and started them to shut down. We knew a lot of information about their actors and affiliates. So using this knowledge, communicating to them on Talks and Jabber and other services, looking for an ESXi locker is essentially how we landed on BlackMatter. So this is actually BlackMatter's panel. First day you join, you get all this information. So it says, we take the best features from Revil, DarkSide, Lockbit. We've tested all our platform and our vulnerabilities. To give you a little context, DarkSide had a decryption issue in the past, which we'll talk about later. And there's talking about it uses on, or all the things it works on, all the NAS devices, Linux, ESXi, all the Windows versions. And yeah, go ahead. So here you see, on the left is DarkSide panel. On the right is BlackMatter panel. Pretty visually similar to them. You'll have the way to do your different builds on the top right, all the company victim information, the Bitcoin addresses. You can see it's relatively the same panel.
Cool. So at the outset, there were two versions that were released initially, one for Windows and one for Linux and ESXi. So the Windows ransomware did have some fairly extensive anti-reverse engineering and anti-analysis capabilities. Nothing insurmountable, but definitely harder than average. Comparatively, the Linux and ESXi one was very straightforward. So it actually included function names that they did not actually scrub from it, and the configuration file, which gives you kind of information about what it should do that threat actors configured to do, was deobfuscated, which made it substantially easier to reverse engineer. So on the bottom right, you can see examples of what those function names do. And in case you're not a reverse engineer, one of the things that's like really kind of just gold is when threat actors leave these things in, because if you're trying to figure out what a function is doing, it's really helpful to have the name with specific things such as get running VM. So that really does help speed up some of the analysis there. And on the top, you can see an example of the Windows ransom note that it dropped. So generally when we talk about tracking a threat actor's tools, there's a couple different things that we'll start to look for. So really what you want to look for is something unusual or distinctive that that specific actor does. So some places that I generally like to look, so first cryptographic routines. So these can range in interesting kind of combinations of the cryptographic routines, which we'll get into soon, or things that they implement custom. So not true crypto, but like string obfuscation routines and something like that. Sometimes threat actors will roll their own and they'll do it incorrectly. And if it's something that they do that is particularly distinctive, you can also use that to signature on. So one example of BlackMatter string decryption routine you can see in the top image. We'll look at the key init function soon, but this was something where they had strings were not in plain text. They made it harder to reverse engineer by doing some light obfuscation to them. But it was one of the elements of the first signature that we were able to write for them because it was unique. So other obfuscation techniques that threat actors might use can also help you start tracking them, especially, again, if they are unique. So, for example, we can look at some of the call obfuscation that BlackMatter used. So on the bottom is a very normal kind of Windows API call, really how you would see it when you're reverse engineering it. You can see call to the specific function. BlackMatter didn't do that. So in order to make it harder to reverse engineer, what they had was they had a magic value, and then they'd XOR that value with another value, and then jump to that address in order to make the call. So if you're doing static reverse engineering, Now you have to figure out where it is jumping to and where in memory and what's loaded there, which complicates it substantially. However, this was another element of the signature that we were able to create because this magic value appeared all throughout the code, and it was something that was just baked in and pretty distinctive. So again, magic numbers, very helpful, especially if it's something that they derive on their own and nobody else is really using. And while BlackMatter did not do this, one of my personal favorites is misspellings. So sometimes you'll see error messages or log messages or file names, mutex names, different strings that are in the malware that they've misspelled. And if it's a particularly distinctive misspelling and it goes throughout versions, they don't change it, that can also be pretty useful. So we put out a report in July. And after we released this report, new versions of the Windows ransomware started to appear. So some of them were fairly simple changes, such as that magic X or key started changing. And then others were more complex, so the addition of new features. So one of the examples of how the string encryption actually changed, so we talked about that key init function. On the top was the very simplistic one that they used in their first version. We put out a little Python script to decode the strings, and then several versions later, we actually noticed the encryption key initialization for the string obfuscation changed substantially, became substantially more complex, and you can see that on the bottom. Ultimately, we never actually saw another version of the Linux and ESXi ransomware. Not entirely sure why, but there you go. And ultimately, between July 2021 and September 2021, we saw them release 6 different versions of their ransomware, version numbers 1.2 to 3.0. So let's talk a little bit about some of those feature additions. So we'll get into some of these, but things like printing the ransomware note on local printers to add some excitement, I guess, when you encrypt. Encrypting additional file types, so adding that support as well. Letting the threat actor identify specific computers not to encrypt. So on the right, you can see an example of kind of the build panel where you can configure it and say, what kinds of folders to whitelist, files, different things like that, so you could identify which computers to avoid. The implementation of their cryptographic algorithm, and then looking for large files and encrypting them differently. So in a ransomware attack, time is of the essence for the threat actor because they want to encrypt everything as fast as possible so that the victim can't, stop it midway, and they really have kind of maximum impact. So being able to encrypt large files, you'll sometimes see threat actors encrypt only pieces of them at increments, whatever, to just make them so that they're not usable, but not waste any time in getting as much damage as quickly as possible. So let's look at a couple of the specific features. So between versions 1.6 and 2.0, we saw them modify some of their print the ransomware note to printers function. Here's an example. So on the left, in versions 1.6 to 1.9, we saw them just say print anything as long as the printer isn't named PDF, because that's a virtual printer. But over time, they actually evolved this to say ignoring PDF and then some additional virtual printers. So kind of another interesting element of their obfuscation, you can see instead of looking for the specific names, they take a hash of the name to make it just a little bit more complicated. It's a custom hashing algorithm. We talked a little bit about encrypting different kinds of files. So on the left, you can see they added the ability first to encrypt Microsoft Exchange files. And that's kind of how they did it. And then they added the capability to handle the large ones differently. So we talked a little bit about why there's a point to that. So what they do is they check for different extensions and then behave differently accordingly. So you may remember, MZSoft actually came out with a decryptor for BlackMatter ransomware that said victims do not have to purchase the crypto key to decrypt, and they can still decrypt their ransomware, which suggests that there's some kind of cryptographic issue. So the threat actor supposedly fixed the issue in about late September 2021. We can't really speak to the specific cryptographic issue at hand here, but you can kind of see some evolution in how at least the key initialization code came between the different versions. So there are other kind of changes in the other crypto code, but we won't get into those. So you can see version 1.2, 2.0, and 3.0 kind of stacked right there. Won't necessarily get into that, but it is interesting to see sort of like how they make those little changes, especially if there was a bug. So we talked a little bit about the overlap between DarkSide and BlackMatter. So other researchers actually suggested that looking at how the kind of cryptographic key material was generated. So using the custom salsa 20 matrix that had previously been unique to DarkSide, so we talked about like unique and interesting crypto, was now something that they were observing a very similar cryptographic routine in BlackMatter. So what this looks like between them, so you can see the random buffer initialization for BlackMatter or for DarkSide on the top, followed by the RSA 1024 encryption, and then you can see BlackMatter's implementation on the bottom. So not entirely, exactly the same, but you do see some similarities. So slight difference in how they actually did the generation of the random buffer, but semantically it's pretty similar. So that's what the researchers are pointing out. We just want to give an example of that. So now I hand it back over to James to talk about the end.
Thanks, Lindsay. So DarkSide had the Colonial Pipeline attack. They messed up on that, a little too high profile for them. They also had the decryption issues, which we didn't talk about specifically, but with BlackMatter we did. So they've had decryption issues for BlackMatter as well. They hit a agricultural entity really heavily that caused a lot of issues, and the security researchers jumped into that chat and just took over it, and they couldn't differentiate between victim and researcher, and just they were really flustered at the time. So they've made critical mistakes, and they just announced that they're done with it, they're shutting down. So this is actually the panel saying, in 48 hours, we're gone, we're gonna hand out decryption keys. So it sounds like it's the end of BlackMatter, but it's not. So this is actually an interview by one of our colleagues that reaches out to another ransomware called Alpha, and they basically admitted to it. So if you read through it, it will say that with the victim chats having issues and not being able to tell between victim and impersonator, and the decryption issues, this caused us to shut down. And then we see another actor, Lockbit, say this is BlackMatter doing a rebranding. So what BlackMatter did was they were mad, they just fired the entire dev team for the locker. And we'll show. So this right here, this is Alpha, and this is basically the intro to their new ransomware project. And it says we have ESI lockers, you get a certain percentage of cut. They completely redid the locker, wrote it in Rust, lots of new fancy features. They made it specific, so if you capture a ransom node on VirusTotal, you can't actually do anything with it because you have to have a specific access code to be able to visit the victim panel. They rewrote the entire panel itself. They added a lot of features, new support tools, new FAQs, built-in mixers. They're actually working on another thing called Morph, which allows near real-time obfuscation of the locker itself to bypass some signatures. So they're still around.
So as probably defenders, we're probably asking, what is it now that we do? Because it seems like they spin up, they spin down, they rebrand, they join new programs. So what is it that we can do? So one of the things I want to underscore is that in order to successfully find malicious threat actors after they kind of disappear, it really does require a very multifaceted approach. So not only the technical skills and signatures and things like that, but also subject matter experts who know kind of how to find them and what to start looking for. Also detections, I have to mention that. So looking for things like those commonly used tools and TTPs, so things like Cobalt Strike will remain eternally popular with APTs and ransomware threat actors, and it's very easy to get. So while that won't completely solve the problem, being able to detect these sort of malicious tools and their use does get you, some of the way. Looking for also the latest threats. So things like pre-ransomware tools or new open source technology and tools is really important. Like I said, they can read the same things that we see. Like they look at GitHub, if they find new tools that they like and help them accomplish their goals, they're probably going to use them. So keeping abreast of what is going on now, what people are releasing, and then what could be useful is also important. Kind of very well-known detection types, so things like Yara, Sigma, and Snort, wherever possible to be able to track either from a defensive perspective, or if you like to threat hunt or look for malware to take apart, can help you start finding these specific or threat actor specific tools, like some of what we talked about. Other IOC feeds as well are super useful, so knowing command and control servers, malicious hashes, things like that. And then we all talk a lot about logging and turning on logging, but making sure that the logs capture exactly what you think they should, so that in the event that something does in fact happen, you're able to get the information that you expect and would probably need to figure out, what happened in case you weren't able to stop it. Doing things like implementing common security measures, so account pruning, strong passwords, etc. Active Directory, James talked a little bit about, having access to Active Directory is pretty powerful, so making sure you're doing cleanup, disabling legacy objects, and then implementing best practices there. And then finally, consider using multi-factor authentication for things like remote access services like RDP and Citrix. So these are still popular with ransomware threat actors, and they will take advantage of them. So with that, are there any questions?
Yeah, so how much does a toolkit like this cost the average criminal?
Well, it doesn't really come as a whole package. It all depends on what you're looking for. If it's a So if you have access to a whole bunch of compromised machines and you want to buy information stealer, it costs very little, because all you're essentially doing is buying access to the panel, you're generating the builder, and then you're sending it to the networks you already own. So it could be a few $100 a month, maybe less. It all depends on usage and how much you want to get access to.
So what's the actual crypto lockers themselves, right? Is it significant, or they?
So they're free. All these are free. Yeah.
They're sharing a portion of the.
Yeah, so what they do is basically, if you join as an affiliate, they have a core set of administrators. The people inside these groups don't know who each other are. There are certain subsets. So the administrators know themselves, most of them personally. This small subset, so let's say, for instance, you join and you were the one that owned the keys. If you have that guy, and that guy that don't know each other in real life, but you know enough to work and get a network, they're not going to know any of that, and other teams won't know that as well. It's only just who you have. So the more networks you compromise and more successful payments you have depends on the cut. So initially, for Alpha, since they just started, it was 90%. So 90% goes to you, your team to divvy out how you want, and then 10% goes to the administrator for building additional functions, paying, buying new cars, whatever it is. And you'll see a lot of it go like that. If you don't do well, you can either get kicked out of the group or kicked down to 80%, 75%. But they want as many people. As she said, they're advertisers. That's how they view themselves. By locking in network, you're advertising for them. So
it's an MLM. Literally.
Yeah.
It's an MLM with extra steps.
Yeah.
Are you also seeing any kind of displaced remote connections or backdoors that are being put in place that the administrators themselves can leverage on top of the ransomware happening separate?
Could you give me an example?
Yeah. So I'm the bad guy who is the administrator of the ransomware itself, and I'm looking for affiliates. And the affiliates cause the ransomware attacks to happen or to be perpetrated on assets, right? And then as the systems are being encrypted separately, there's a backdoor maybe that I put in place so that I can come in while everyone is freaking out about the ransomware, and I can do other things, kind of hang out.
Yeah, so there actually was an instance with Reload of that. And there was, when you have access to these panels, normally if it's a really good victim and if you're an affiliate that doesn't feel comfortable talking to a victim, you can just say, I want administrators to handle all the communication, get the payment, and then send it to me. So they can even ask questions. So the administrator, if you're an affiliate and you block this network, the administrator wants to know all these things. He wants to know the Zoom info revenue. He wants to know what they are, as long as they're not a hospital. Because after the DarkSide incident, they put up different rule sets, like don't log hospitals, don't log oil pipelines. So they moderate it before you can even block it. There's mistakes always, but they'll also, I just lost track of thought. What was your question again? Sorry.
No, that's fine. Backdoor access.
Oh, backdoor access, yes. So they have the ability to already see all those chats.
Right.
And there are cases of where they will jump into those chats and take over. There's a whole big, I think there's a few threads on it on Exploit about a guy named Signature that was saying how they stole all this millions of dollars of money through that backdoor using keys that were built into the locker itself. So they do, there's no honor among thieves, and they do actually hijack each other.
Trust backends.
You have to, a little. They trust me, so.
Yep.
I have a couple questions about crypto.
Sure.
First off, as a programmer, we're always told don't ever roll out of crypto.
Yep.
These guys are still doing it years later. Like at first, when ransomware first started, it's like, okay, they're just new, but they'll learn. But they're still doing it. So is this to avoid detection, or is there some other research they're doing?
I mean, it's honestly hard to say why, right? So having something that, will avoid detection, right? That's great. Or maybe like, oh, hey, it's this cool new thing. So it really is hard to say why they do it. Obviously, like, they shouldn't, right? Because mistakes do happen, and then it's like, bad for business if you're not actually having to like sell the key to kind of get it decrypted. So in terms of like the actual kind of locker, would not roll their own. In terms of why they do custom crypto for a lot of the string type stuff, so their job is to slow people like me down, like make it harder for me to figure out what the hell is going on with their ransomware or understand what's going on or write those detections. So having those unique string kind of obfuscation crypto algorithms, having any sort of unique obfuscation, yeah, it takes longer to do.
I mean, writing
That's
crypto gives you more opportunity because if they're using a like very hardened AES implementation, then as long as they protect the key, you're screwed.
yeah, I mean, in terms of the kind of like actual hardcore like crypto to actually, encrypt the files, yes, absolutely. The string encryption stuff, like that's never really like real encryption. That doesn't actually matter. So there are those kind of like two parts of it. But like, yeah, they should totally use actual crypto with the protected key that's proven. But
And the second question is on the key generation itself.
Mhm.
I'm kind of curious how that works. Is there any way like the entry resources that are used can be inferred from the targets so that you can just like reduce the search space? Essentially, you're not going up against a full AES search or whatever if they do the crypto right. You're narrowing down the set of possible inputs to that algorithm so that you can do like a brute force search of a very small space and find the key.
so I am not a deep crypto expert. You might have to ask one of them, but
I was just curious. You mentioned logging as like a really important part of this. I was wondering if logging could infer basically.
so I would say logging would be more useful for, figuring out what they had access to, what they could have accessed, exfiltrated. Did they have any network connectivity? Did they exfiltrate anything? So it's really more of the like, oh, something has happened. What did happen? Did they query any databases? Things like that, if that makes sense.
I can actually add to your first question a little bit. For an example, they do it. So we said that they're advertisers, as they like to put it. Lockbit, if you go to their site on their blog, their public blog, they say we're the fastest locker out there, and it's because they only do a certain amount of locking per file. So of course you're the fastest if you only lock a megabyte worth of data. And then the second aspect to that is you have to realize who these people are. A lot of them are extremely arrogant. They drive fast cars, have a lot of retail or real estate. They think they are better than you. They think that your best practices are you're sitting at a 9-to-5 practices, but they can do better than you. So they feel confident in rolling that.
But if they want fast and safe, why don't they just use AES and I call it day?
Why do they lock corporations?
They're not so good.
Should I comment on that? I know it's an authority, but I support reverse engineers with tools, and I know a lot of times with custom tools, one of the projects I'm currently researching is being able to identify types of algorithms used when they're doing the reverse code, where they have it built in for source, they sometimes just spend a lot more time figuring out what's going on as opposed to a library going, oh, that's encryption, I can look at another piece of code. And I'm also not a security expert, but I've heard that if you know the plain text, if they encrypt the file, the known algorithm, you know what it was, it is also easier to break it. So by quoting your own, you make that harder. Or take away some of the research that other people have done for breaking encryption. So I think
Anybody else? All right, seeing nothing. Thank you guys so much.